Let me just check that both teams are here anyway. So before we start, can I get both teams on your speaker orders? I see government team already. So team opposition, can I do this as well on the chat box? Afterwards, asking for both teams which motion did you veto? Starting from government, which motion did you veto?
Hello, am I audible? We vetoed A, preferred C.
All right, it's noted. What about opposition? Which motion did you veto?
C. We vetoed C and we preferred B.
All right, that's noted. So we'll be debating on the second motion then, on the actively supporting parent-led homeschooling. All right, I also see the speaking orders from the opposition, so thank you so much for that as well. All right, then, so let's do a couple introduction from the round of judges. So I'll start. So hi everyone, name's Chris. I'm your chair for this round. No particular pronouns, but since we are a panel, just do address us as a panel. Congratulations for making it this far and best of luck. I'd also like to invite my panel, so please introduce themselves according to the order that's in the ballot.
Hello, I'm Jose. No preferred pronouns. This address us as panel. Congratulations on making this task one. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Nathaniel or Nathan. Congratulations for reaching the final for Novice and good luck everyone for the round.
I'm Roger. Good luck everyone. Please refer to the panel as a whole. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Westmamo. I'm glad to be here. Let's enjoy the round.
Amazing. Thank you so much everyone for the wonderful introduction. All right then, so before we start the debate, we'll be sending timestamps on the Zoom chat. However, it's recommended that you time your own speeches as well as the speeches for after yours. And before you start your speech, just kindly indicate if you'd like your POIs raised to be verbal or chat, just for the sake of the debaters and the debate itself. All right then, let's start the debate with the motion that reads, this House believes that government should actively support parent-led homeschooling for their children. To start the debate, PM, here.
Here.
Yep, here.
Yep, I'm going to start my speech in 15 seconds. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Dear honorables and judges, we present to you an ongoing issue that has been going on for a very long time. We are not, as a society and as a government, we are not doing enough to help children who are being homeschooled. And we need to do more for them because there is an ongoing disparity between children who are being homeschooled with the parents leading this homeschooling program and children who are going to public schools or in the context of private schools. And we need to lessen this disparity because we support the getting rid of the discrimination and the disparity because we want to help these children who are being homeschooled when they become adults and enter into adulthood to provide them an equal starting point, right? And we believe that in current status quo, this is not happening, which is why we should absolutely, as a government, actively support parent-led homeschooling. Let's look at our stakeholders, number one. Who are the children? Who are the people who are being homeschooled in the current status quo? These children are the most vulnerable children. These are the children who do not have the money to, these are the children who are like super religious, such as like the Quakers. These are the children who have paranoid parents, and these are the children who are victims of trauma and bullying in queer kids because they cannot actively socialize and actively adjust into these public schools and these private schools that are not into homeschooling settings, right? We need to care about these vulnerable people and we need to care about these safeties. We're talking about the children who are in Florida, the trans children and the queer children who cannot go to school because Ron DeSantis is making legislation that denies their very existence and taking their rights and then putting their rights up for debate, right? And these children, they do not have money to go out of state or to go somewhere else, right? This is why they are they do not have a choice but to abide in these parents-led homeschooling settings. These are our stakeholders and these are our vulnerable people. And we believe that as a government, we need to help these people because there is an ongoing disparity. So on to my first argument. What is our first argument? Our first argument is about the flaws in the status quo on 2 levels of analysis. The first level of analysis is the social problems. There is an inherent lack of socialization that exists in terms of parents-led homeschooling. Why? Because there is not a lot of children who these children can interact with, right? Because at the end of the day, public schools, they have a benefit of socializing the children, which is why there is a social problem and we need to address this problem. Number 2, what is the second level of analysis? Academic problem, right? In the case, right, an academic problem because these children, they do not have the equal amount of resources in terms of academics, right? They do not have access to higher education such as SATs, APs, and they do not have access to libraries, right? These are the things that we are worried about, and that these are the things that we are believed that are going to cause an inherent disparity, right? So why is this going to help, right? Because in the cases that these that these parents that homeschool children are doing like already better, this is only going to help them do even better, right? This is only going to help them even more. But in the cases that they are performing worse and they are underperforming, children who are in public school settings, we believe that these resources, in the forms of supporting them, can help, right? Now we are going to define what the supporting looks like. This supporting is going to look like restructuring and reforming homeschool and providing infrastructure that is needed, right? Some examples that we can give you is like that we gave earlier is like library accesses, access to SATs and APs, and diverse education, so we can diversify the pool and diversify the education that they're receiving, so that we can solve these ongoing disparity problems, which is, like I said earlier, social problems in terms of socialization and academic problems because they are underperforming, right? And now I'm going to tell you about the end goal again. The end goal is that we should alleviate the discrimination because we want to help these children when they reach adulthood to have equal starting points in society, right? We cannot risk the discrimination that they're facing, right? Because children need to meet the standard of education, and we want to live in a world where homeschool kids have the similar opportunities and chances as traditionally schooled kids, right? And in terms of in comparison to the level of public schooling that the children in public schooling are receiving, right? But to our second point, as a preemptive, we believe that the opposition is going to come in and say things such as, oh, bigoted parents are going to indoctrinate children, and we believe that this is a risk. We believe that opposition is going to say this. But however, what we would say to that is that in our world, we are more likely to the parents of these bigoted children are more likely to consider different options. At least we're doing something to help these children who are living in these environments. Who are these bigoted parents? These are parents who are like anti-schooling and anti-institution, and they believe that children do not belong in schools, and they should only be educated in the context and in the spheres of the homeless things, right? However, we believe that on our side of the house, we are more likely to consider different options because once again, what are we doing? We are providing more infrastructure and more support for these children, right? But on opposition side, we believe that there's being still that on opposition side, these children are still being homeschooled, right? Because they're still being homeschooled. They're not going to public schools because we have already told you that these children are under bigoted parents who are anti-establishment and anti-institution. So they're still going to be in the houses, right? But what is opposition side doing? They're not doing anything to support and anything to provide more infrastructure and more support. So at least the change that we are providing to you, the judges, is that we are giving more infrastructure and support, right? And this is going to once again lessen the potential harms that goes on in the context of homeschooling, and we believe that this is the only course and the right course to take care of our stakeholders. Once again, who are they? The most vulnerable people who cannot go to public school because of either cultural or religious reasons. They have paranoid parents, or they're victims of trauma and bullying, and queer kids. So to sum up our case, we believe that disparities should be actively decreased as the government, and which is why we should actively support parents-led homeschooling for the children. We're doing it for the queer children. We're doing it for the impoverished. We're doing it for the disenfranchised, and we believe this is why we win as the government side. Thank you.
I think the speaker for a fine speech. Now to open the cash. Hello, you're here.
Please tell them I had technical difficulties. They can see that.
I'm sorry. Our leader of opposition had some technical difficulties. So can he use
I'm
another?
rejoining Zoom in for 20 seconds. I'm
Yeah.
literally opening up now. So I'm just tell them. Can they hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
cool. Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we're clear. There's just a slightly bit of an echo feedback.
Yeah, it's because someone else had their mic on, but it's I think it should be sorted now.
Okay, yeah, now it's perfectly clear. Can we proceed?
Yeah, sorry about that. My computer just crashed. Okay. So can you guys just start talking? So I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So obviously the government said that the core issue here is that we need to help the children who are homeschooled, and that's the fundamental function of this debate. And we agree that those are probably one of the most important groups of children that should be homeschooled, that should be supported as well. So we agree that that's the key stakeholder that should be supported in this particular case. One particular definition challenge we'd like to look at first is the assumption that just because they're homeschooled, that they're therefore one of the most vulnerable members of society. People could choose to homeschool for all kinds of reasons. They could be rich, they could be religious, they could be powerful, so on and so forth. There may be in the current status quo a particular propensity towards religious parents doing this, but as we will discuss in future points, there are some issues with having what you would call bigoted parents in point 2, but generally religious parents, or particularly what we would call dogmatic parents, being the ones who are raising kids. And we believe that this is going to cause a particular problem, both for the people who are homeschooled and for the other people around them. So the thing you said in point 1 was this: society doesn't recognize homeschooling. And there's a reason that society doesn't recognize homeschooling, and that's the reason why homeschool children can't go into the market. And we agree, there is a challenge with this because society doesn't recognize it. But perhaps there is a reason society doesn't recognize it. What you didn't really talk about here is what the reasons for as to why a society should value homeschooling as opposed to sending their kids into public education. Perhaps there is a reason society values this. No, not just yet. And as you said in point 2, you said you're going to focus on bigoted parents. You assume that we will focus on bigoted parents, and that will be the center of our case. We believe that there is an element to bigoted parents that are a problem, and the fact that you're even suggesting that you're going to defend bigoted parents as being good teachers is particularly problematic. By definition, that they're bigoted and they're the only source of socialization and education for these children. But we're not even going to focus on them. They're a very, very small part of our argument. Anyway, so the primary stakeholders that we think in this are, the primary stakeholder really are the children that are likely to be taken out of school. And the way we're going to talk about this is through what we consider to be the 2 core functions of an education system. The first one is socialization. The second one is education. I will spend the majority of my speech on socialization. I will introduce education, which will then be extended upon by our DLO. So the socialization elements of this. So we believe that we can separate children into 2 relevant types: generally pro-social children and generally antisocial children. Now, when we say generally pro-social, what we mean is they're happy around other children. They prefer to work in teams. They prefer being around other kids. They like to have multiple teachers, multiple faces. They really just enjoy being out in the world and seeing other people. Now, if these children are taken out of school by their parents, we believe it's fairly obvious that they'll be less happy. And if they're less happy, they'll have psychological damage. And we believe the psychological damage will probably cause them to, psychological damage is a harm in and of itself, but this psychological damage will likely cause worse educational outcomes. Children who are minimally happy and also educated properly are the ones who have the greatest success. And we believe that these generally pro-social children will be made much less happy, therefore worse educational outcomes, worse psychological outcomes. That's the obvious group. The more interesting group here are generally antisocial children. Now, children who are generally antisocial, meaning the opposite of what I just said, they're unhappy around other kids, they're maladapted to social norms, so on and so forth. What's the best solution for these children? So solution number one, take them out of school to avoid the immediate unhappiness, the immediate anxiety of going into school and having all the students hate them. And they go home, they pick up their Xbox, they watch TV, they do whatever other stuff they want to do at home to distract their minds. Immediate utility gain. Sure, fine. But this doesn't redress the real underlying issues of their antisocial behavior. Their antisocial behavior could be caused by a whole bunch of things. It could be something that's psychological. It could be something which is, or something which is just as simple as just they made one simple social mistake and they didn't really understand how to rectify it, and things just got worse and worse and worse over time. What they really need is somebody to teach them the error of their ways, teach them how to apologize, teach them how to be kinder to other students, teach them how to be happy, so on and so forth. Now, we believe that what's interesting is that in the status quo, there are these systems in place to give these children these socialization opportunities. It's a function of a teacher to both teach a child how to be educated properly and also to teach them how to be socialized. Are teachers always really good at doing this? Is it a perfect model? Are some of them bullies? Are some of them useless? Sure. But generally speaking, that's the teacher's core functional role. There is also an increasing propensity to fund counseling services for these children. And a lot of the time, these children have older siblings. Again, older siblings, not perfect, but generally good at teaching how to be a well-socialized adult when you leave school. And the other thing that's interesting about this is that in the in government's world, they're assuming that the parents will have so much time that they can homeschool children. Well, if we can assume that the parents who would choose to homeschool children now are perhaps anti-normalized against it, so to speak, then they have all this free time to help socialize their children. So the parents also have a boatload of time, even if we assume, or comparatively to the amount of time that would be required in government's world. And so let's just do a quick stakeholder analysis of this. So the two core stakeholders in this, of this particular argument, are these children, as I mentioned, as I said, particularly of the antisocial children. As adults, they will have less friends, they'll struggle to find work, they'll struggle to find a romantic partner, and will generally less happy and less productive. And the reason they'll struggle to find work, and the reason society values a public education system, is precisely because the people who don't go through it are not socialized in the right way. They don't understand social norms. They don't understand how to make people feel happy and comfortable in their presence. This is the reason why they struggle to find work. This is the reason why people generally tend to have some degree of prejudice towards homeschooling. Not because of some weird fascist racism or whatever it is that you were suggesting, as if society is just clubbing homeschooling over the head for no reason. And the other stakeholder that's relevant here are the other members of the community. Antisocial adults are significantly more likely to commit sexual assault, physical assault, engage in toxic and illegal behaviors, join right-wing conspiracy online chat rooms and troll people, install webcams or whatever, and generally lead to more crime in general. And so the challenge is that you're suggesting a system in which more children are going to be taken out of school, and they'll either be pro-social and be made unhappy and less productive, or they'll be antisocial and not really have the antisocial issues ever dealt with. And I'll just move on to the second point really quickly. I have 25 seconds, I get that. So regarding education, we believe that education in a school is better primarily for two reasons. Well, one reason really stemming from the fact that you're learning from teachers. What is it that teachers give you? Teachers give you experience, education, qualifications. They know exactly how to deal with specific problems that change and adapt over time. And secondly, you're less likely to absorb the dogma of your parents. And this brings me to the bigoted point that I mentioned earlier. You don't want children to be absorbing dogmatic and bigoted views from their parents. So we do think that in those cases, those children are better off being socialized in a normal education system. Thank you very much.
Thank the speaker for the fine speech. Now to extend the case for Gov, DPM, here.
Oh my God. Give me a second. Why did you do that? My mic was on. My mic is still on. Wait. Just get my timer. Right. Hi. DPM. No. My speech will start in around 10 seconds. Right. Yeah. POIs through voice. I'll probably miss it if it's through chat, so please through voice. Again, no preferred gender pronouns. Yeah. Starts in 3, 2, 1. So 3 things in my speech. First, I'm going to go over some rebuttals to what the leader of the opposition has told you. Second, move on to some substantive material coming from our bench. Third, comparative why the government clearly wins. First, rebuttals, right? So this is what we get from the LO. They've told us that we cannot assume that the people who are homeschooled are just the most vulnerable, right? And tell us that rich and powerful are also homeschooled. However, we tell you that these people are to be prioritized in our debate and important because they literally have no other option because they are so vulnerable and they have no they are not able to go to public school in the first place, right? We tell you that the rich and powerful are not compromised in the first place if more support is provided for homeschooling and no harms are done in the first place. So we don't really know why how this negates the case in any way. Second point, another point that they give us is that these dogmatic parents are an issue. But they don't really tell us why this is exclusive on our side of the house, right? Because homeschooling, I think we just clarified that homeschooling is going to exist regardless on both sides of the house. Dogmatic parents are still going to exist on their side. However, we tell you that this support is not going to encourage and worsen the indoctrination, but rather provide them resources to consider different perspectives. Sure, some parents might not budge, right? We tell you at least it is more likely that they will consider this anyway, right? Also, we tell you on their side of the house, these bigoted parents are not likely to send their kids to public school anyway because they're anti-government, anti-institution. They don't agree with the public education system, right? Another thing that they tell us is, oh, we're just defending bigoted parents. We tell you on either side of the house, these bigoted parents are going to do whatever they want. On our side, at least we have some kind of government intervention so that at least there's a 1 to 2% chance that they will consider different perspectives because now they are given a different infrastructure to work with. Another thing that they tell us is, oh, why should we support homeschooling if we should just support public school instead? We tell you that we've already told you coming from the PM that some people simply have no other option, simply are too vulnerable, it's just too dangerous to go to public school. If I were a parent and I had a trans kid and we were lived in Florida, where obviously, there, please, these people just simply, obviously, they're going to feel very unsafe sending their child to a public school, right, where they are very likely to be hate crime. Yes, why?
Do you not accept that with a greater normalization of public schools, there's going to be an inevitable increase in the uptake of people going to homeschools, and so all of the harms we suggest that are going to be maximized in your normalization regime?
Okay, so are you saying that this support is going to normalize it? Okay, so on either side of the house, we're telling you that homeschooling, public schools are still going to exist. But why is the support necessary in the first place, right? That's what we're telling you in the first place. And we also tell that all the harms are mitigated if this support is provided. Also, another thing they tell us is that the public schools are better because they're able to socialize. 3 responses. First is that support like this support system is, we've already mechanized it, and which includes like connection with other high school kids. Another thing is like public schools are normalized as well in the status quo, and like even if the support is already there, it's not like a slippery slope where suddenly everyone's going to start homeschooling. Suddenly homeschooling is so much better. All we're doing is leveling the playing field so that homeschooling is on the same level as public schools, right? Another thing is that we are not suggesting like we're all like we're like anti-education or something, right? These homeschool kids, like some of them just simply cannot or will not go to school. Another thing is this active support in homeschooling is likely to lead to like they're telling us that this is likely to lead to like discouraging like public schools, when we're telling you again, we're simply providing better resources, more infrastructure, so that homeschooling is on the same level as public school, right? This is exactly why we need we need government support, because homeschooling will happen regardless. But we tell you, because there is a problem in the status quo, and it will also actually mitigate the harms about these bigoted parents. This is exactly why we need government support in regards to homeschooling. All right, now moving on to substantive material. But again, we really want to emphasize that there are vulnerable stakeholders in the debate. Parents and children with no other option but homeschooling. This can include neurodivergent people, people of color, people who are part of the LGBT community, right? These people simply cannot perfectly integrate into public schools. And even if we try to normalize these kids going into like public schools and provide different types of resources, policies, infrastructure, so that they can fit in, this is going to be a much bigger change and even more difficult and take even longer, right? We have to help like the homeschool kids like right now, because these issues are still ongoing, and we cannot wait for these children to grow up and get out of school, and we cannot compromise these children's future just because like we don't want to support homeschooling, right? Again, these people are simply just have no other option in life. They were already robbed of the chance to safely attend public school. They're already disadvantaged in society. Therefore, we tell you it is very necessary for the government to intervene in the first place, because there is already a promise in the status quo in terms of the poor infrastructure with homeschooling. We like bigger steps such as like, we need to like help them reintegrate and like go to public schools is simply more difficult, like because changes in discrimination, oppression, and the social narrative in terms of like LGBT, the people who are disabled, people of color, are simply so much more difficult that we cannot simply like just wait for like these big changes to happen, right? What the government side is, what the opposition side is basically telling us is like, oh, we should not support homeschooling because of these harms. We tell you, yes, these harms exist, but will continue to exist on opposite side of the house because people will still be homeschooled. But we tell you, with this support, at least we help the vulnerable stakeholders who are homeschooled, but also have a chance, at least a small, slim chance of mitigating these harms. So what's the comparative, right? We think the discussion should be whether the government should be supporting this parent-led homeschooling or not. The opposition needs to prove why the support is either unnecessary or do exclusive harm, right? For example, like giving power to bigoted parents, right? We tell you, like, in actuality, again, we have already mechanized to you why like these bigoted parents are likely to consider different perspectives, and these children are more likely to get help, right? It's not this debate is not about the benefits or harms of homeschooling. That is not the crux of the debate, right? There's a comparative. In the opposition's world, people will still be homeschooled. The harms that they give you about people can't socialize, these people will stay vulnerable, will still exist, right? And just pushing them into public school will simply not work, right? We tell you that this support is necessary because in the status quo, there is a disparity between the quality of education in public schools and private schools. And there is obviously people who simply have no other option to attend public schools, right? Now moving on to like some like parents, like we tell you, we want to clarify, like some parents on either side of the house will like still like won't budge, like whether there's support or not, they will still continue to like send their children to homeschool their kids, right? But we tell you that at least some parents like will have to choose homeschooling, like will choose homeschooling for the benefit of the child, for example, like having a trans kid, right? That is why like the government's concern is like, it doesn't matter if the kid is homeschooled. It's not really the government's matter whether the kid is homeschooled or not. But we tell you, this support is not just necessary, but also will actually mitigate all the harms coming from the opposition, and that is why we clearly won this debate. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for a fine speech. Now to extend the case for all yellow here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, here.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3. Oh, and timer. Sec. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, so we at Side Opposition believe that the traditional schooling system has something that's inherently valuable that homeschooling simply cannot provide, right? It provides you not just with education, but the opportunity to mature as a functioning member of society, right? So because of this, no matter how much Gov comes to us with, why we should protect the antisocial kids who are being homeschooled, right? If you're not changing the characteristic of homeschool education in the first place, then it doesn't matter because these individuals will never be able to flourish or properly mature as functioning members of society, which I'm going to delve into like the harms of this later in my speech. But first, a couple of rebuttals. So from the previous speaker, I got mainly two things. Number one, they talked about dogmatic parents and how we're going to focus on them like as a primary stakeholder. Well, first of all, we think that dogmatic parents are not that relevant to this debate because we think that they're relatively a minority case, but we find it very interesting because if they want to normalize homeschooling education, wouldn't the education that these dogmatic parents offer just become more normalized and become more legitimized as a result? So isn't the harm that they're trying to argue on our side of the house actually inherent to their side of the house? Because if you normalize homeschool education, these dogmatic conservative parents will say, hey, the education I'm providing to my kid is actually legit. I can keep on going with this. And then boom, their kid becomes significantly more radicalized, more antisocial. And as our LO explained, this leads to real harms, such as them being more likely to assault people, them being more antisocial, them not getting a job, etc. The second thing I'd like to mention is being bullied, right? So we bite the bullet and concede that yes, like some antisocial kids, when forced to go through education, will get bullied. But we think that this is a relatively short-term harm. And it's like when you look at it from a longevity perspective, actually going through like those hard days in school, but then ultimately learning the skills of socialization, of what the social code is, we feel like in the long term, in their world, you get disenfranchisement of minorities, disenfranchisement from like just exclusion from society as a whole, which is a much more longer term harm, right? If you choose to stay out of school for the sole reason of getting bullied. So we think that we beat them on this aspect as well. Now on to the main clash of this debate, which panel I believe is crystal clear. How do we help the antisocial children of society, right? Who do not prefer to be in public school. So government says we will make society recognize the value of homeschooling and give extra resources. Two things here. With regards to normalization, it's very vague, right? Because like how can you just magically get society to accept homeschooling as a norm, right? Like without much sufficient mechanization, it doesn't really make sense what they're trying to argue here. And with regards to more resources, we feel like, as I mentioned before, when you're not changing the characteristic of homeschool education, if you're not embedding social lessons, life lessons, engaging with a variety of different ideas, if you don't like systematically change what homeschooling is like, then you're not fixing the problem, you're just moving the problem away. Like what point is it if someone who's homeschooled gets extra support and more resources, but then the education they receive doesn't fundamentally change, right? They don't gain the other life skills that public schooling kids get, right? Doesn't fix the problem at all. So we say in response that we will still send these antisocial kids to school, but in lieu of making them go under homeschooling instead, we're going to give them additional support. Because why is public school necessary? Well, we believe, as I mentioned, public schooling or like traditional education provides an experience that is fundamentally different to homeschooling. So no matter how much you support homeschooling, we feel like public schooling is simply the better alternative because one, it allows you to socialize better. And number two, there's an inherently higher value in the education that traditional schooling offers, which I'm going to get into. So yeah. So now on to rebuilding my LO's case. So our LO touched upon why public schooling or traditional schooling is better on the metric of learning how to socialize, i.e. social skills. I'm going to touch more on how traditional schooling or like public schooling is better like in terms of its value of education, the value of education it offers. There's 4 layers of analysis here. Number one, re-emphasizing what my LO said, teachers, right? Teachers are specialized and they have expertise, right? Teachers are teachers for a reason. They respond, adapt, lecture, they build on the students' strengths, they tell the students of their weaknesses. So if this teaching role is given to the parents, there are 2 scenarios that unfold. Number one, either they teach the kids themselves, which we believe will significantly decrease the quality of their education, right? Because parents weren't built for this task. Or number 2, even if we take their best case and they hire private tutors, from the perspective of the parents' perspective, it's a lot more expensive and unsustainable in the long run, right? And like, because there's no regulation, not as much proper regulation of private tutors. Like, heck, I am a private tutor, right? I tutor kids, and I can tell you this, I do not tutor them as well as professional teachers, right? So the quality of education decreases significantly on their side of the house. Number two, this is a harm that they keep telling us about how, like, in our world, right, like the radicalization, this is a harm from their world, sorry. A harm in their world is the radicalization of certain children. We can see that this is a minority case. Only certain parents are conservative and super weird, right? But then if you're indoctrinated with a single set of values because of a conservative parent or a super like radical parent that you have, it's very risky that if this sustains itself for a long period of time, you're going to end up with a very skewed perception of the world around you, right? And this is even worse than an echo chamber. So transitioning to my third point, this is why in our world, we believe that there is an inherent value in being exposed to a variety of different ideas, right? So as you interact with different students and different teachers from, grade 1 to grade 12, right? You're going to be exposed to liberal ideas, conservative ideas, and we think this exposure is valuable for two reasons. Number one, it reflects the reality, like what real life is like as a whole, right? Like in the job market, you're going to encounter conservative individuals, liberal individuals, and being exposed to a melting pot of ideas is far more valuable than just being exposed to one set of ideas or a limited set of ideas at best. Number two, it allows you to foster critical thinking skills, right? It allows you to assess different claims. Like you come to the realization that not all truth is a given. You come to the realization that like, truth is something you fight for. And like, if you're at a position where you're met with conflicting stances, you have to balance both claims. And this is a skill that we get from engaging with other individuals, which is something that you can only get in traditional education. Last but not least, maturing through independence, right? So we believe that if you undergo the public schooling system, and a harm that they claim on our side of the house is, yeah, you get bullied, yeah, you cry in public school, yeah, you can't adjust, right? But we think that another way to view these negative experiences in the short term is that they're life lessons in the long term, right? Like if you cry in kindergarten because someone kicked you, like for kicking them out of the line, right? That's a life lesson that you learn. There's a certain social, like, like you don't mess with people if you want to like not like treat people with respect, in the sense that you want to be treated with respect as well. These are life lessons that you learn from these negative experiences that these antisocial kids are going to endure. So to sum up, government has failed in characterizing why homeschooling is something that needs to be constantly supported by the government. We think that public schooling, traditional schooling, is way more beneficial for actually turning students into grown-ups and individuals that can function in society. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
The speaker for a fine speech. Now to summarize the case for the government, GovWhip. Here.
Thank you. Am I audible at the moment?
Yep, we're clear.
Okay, wonderful. Hello, everybody. My name is Naama. I will be government whip. I go by she, her, but when referring to me in other speeches, I much prefer just replacing pronouns with whip or government whip for clarity. I will also accept POIs verbally. I don't really check the chat much during the debate, so that would be better for everybody if you want to be heard. I'll start my speech in about 5 seconds. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Dear honorable judges, what is the goal and the crux of this debate? This is how do we help homeschool kids? And according to our characterization, our world is the only world that is going to help these homeschool kids because we are the only ones who have an actual belief system in place. I will first provide some clarifications, then rebuttals, and then finally move on to final clashes that prove that we won this debate. So first of all, when we're talking about clarification, here is what this debate is not about. This is not about the merits of homeschooling. We have mechanized and explained to you why homeschooling will happen no matter what we do, no matter if public school is normalized, which by the way, it already is, regardless of what opposition bench is throwing at us, homeschooling will still happen. What we're doing in our world is simply improving it. This debate is also not about traditional education versus homeschooling. That is not the weighing that is happening here, and is also not about how to stop dogmatic parents from actually exercising their rights, because that is not the scope of this debate. Moving on to rebuttals to the DLO. So DLO comes on and tells us that there are a lot more benefits to traditional education. And I've already told you why this debate is not about traditional education versus homeschooling. However, they do point out that there are problems with homeschooled kids in the educational and social spheres. We do concede this point, and we do think that there is inherent value in being exposed to different values, which is exactly why we need to be supporting actively supporting homeschooling and providing them with the infrastructure in order to show them these other points of view. So how would we possibly do that? As mentioned by our PM, we might expose them to other homeschooled kids so that they can socialize and have common ground and be able to develop these crucial skills. We do not think that this will happen as effectively in public schools or in private education, even if we were to buy into the opposition case that this is about traditional education versus homeschooling, because these kids are homeschooled for a reason, whether that be because of their parents' choices or because of traumatic experiences or their marginalized identities. These kids are homeschooled for a reason. So while we do agree that there is benefits to traditional education, we actually want these benefits in homeschooling as well, which is why we actively support it. We also get a lot from opposition bench talking about how this would validate dogmatic parents. By the characterization of dogmatic parents as being these fanatic people who will never concede, then they are already going to think that they have validation regardless of whether they get governmental assistance or not. The reason we want to provide this assistance is that, no thank you, is that we think that by providing them assistance, they are even slightly more likely to not fall back onto the dogmatic ideas, which is much better than the status quo in which there is no pushback against their ideas because, as we already told you, public school is normalized. The outlier is homeschooling, which is why this is even a motion. So there is already all of these stereotypes about homeschooling, right? Additionally, there is a really bizarre argument coming from opposition bench downplaying the effects of bullying, which we think is actually insane a little bit because there is actual substantive harms to bullying. People from PTSD and long-term harms and trauma lives with you forever, whether that be childhood or adult trauma. So we do not feel that not thinking about these people who are the most vulnerable people in society and downplaying their trauma as something that they just need to get over with by going to public school is at all helpful to this debate. We also think that relating to the dogmatic parent point brought by DLO, that this will radicalize children, that we are exactly trying to solve this problem because we will have some intervention, which is better than none, as I mentioned earlier. I will now move on to the clashes that I've identified on this debate, which I think all happened due to opposition not willing to accept our side of the house, which is we want to basically change the infrastructure of public schooling. We want to improve it. We want to help and support these families in order to create a more equal stance with traditional education. So the three clashes I identified was, first of all, will homeschooling happen, which actually wasn't even in the debate. I kind of struggled to find relevant clashes. The second being, who are the most vulnerable people that we are trying to protect? And third, will this support benefit our stakeholders, which is in the second clash. So first clash, do we think homeschooling will still happen? So opposition is saying we need to normalize public schools and support people going to public schools. Regardless of the fact, if this wasn't already in the status quo, even if we do this, will these kids benefit from this? No, because as we characterized to you, these are kids from marginalized communities. These are kids who have suffered bullying. These are kids with dogmatic parents who actually other kids might bully them for having dogmatic parents, which is out of their control. These are kids with marginalized identities. These are kids who have these antisocial problems, religious kids, whatever. They will be homeschooled regardless of what other people are telling them because they don't get to choose if they're going to school or not. It's the parents' choice. So extra normalization or whatever is coming from the government bench is not going to affect this at all. The second clash being on who are the most vulnerable stakeholders here. We really want to push back against this yes.
Do you not believe that a lot of the most vulnerable stakeholders, as you mentioned, such as ethnic minorities, will be more likely to be stigmatized if they're taken out of school and just being othered through this process?
Which is exactly why we need to support homeschooling and we need to provide them with all of these social and academic benefits, which were outlined by our PM. So helping them socialize with other children and bringing them up to the academic level of traditional schooling so that they are not outliers later on in life. Thank you. So who are these most vulnerable people that we are talking about? These are not some like one of a kind, like antisocial people. We believe that through our characterization, we have proved that people who are being homeschooled for a specific reason. Now, whether or not that reason is valid is not up for debate, but rather whether or not they are vulnerable. And we have absolutely proved that they are because they are not fit for public education for one reason or another. So we also think that the pool of homeschooled kids is much bigger than what opposition is trying to sell you. And we really urge panel to not buy into that. Finally, will this support benefit our stakeholders, which we just mentioned as being the most vulnerable, right? I would now like to mechanize this on two fronts. So first of all, the academic support that we've mentioned, this would be through resources. So access to libraries, AP courses, these tutors that opposition is concerned with, this would be allowing them access to all of these things that they would otherwise not be able to do. Opposition is trying to tell us that some homeschooled kids have access to this already, and we don't see this as a problem because that's not our goal. Our goal is to help the most marginalized people who do not have access. The second front being the social front, this would be our social support. So for example, connecting these homeschooled kids who have a shared experience and giving them this necessary support. This is also not a policy motion, so I don't feel that this requires any extra mechanization, but we do have space for this to happen within the support that we believe is needed within this motion, right? So what have I told you in all of this debate and what has been coming from government bench is that our support is not saying that homeschooling is better than public education. It is not saying that these people are bad or that they deserve anything like to happen to them negatively, but rather we are trying to help them into society in a much better way through this active support because we think they are the most vulnerable and because these are children we're talking about who cannot make these decisions for themselves. And for that reason, we are very, very proud to propose. Thank you.
The speaker of fine speech. Now to summarize the case for the opposition of whip here.
Am I audible?
Oh, it's echoed for a bit to start, but yeah, otherwise.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, it's much better. Yeah, much better.
Wait, time. Oh. Okay, my speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Okay, Madam Speaker, we believe there is college of education for a reason in the status quo. There is a reason why countries make public schools in the status quo, even though it is not perfect, right? I'm gonna extend this in my classes and tell you why these are in the status quo and why these are the things that should be improved and why like these private education is not a thing that should be supported. So before moving on to my classes, we believe that Thai government today had a very wishy-washy stance to begin with. They said like public school is going to still exist in our world and we can like we're only going to support people who are vulnerable. We have two responses. First, when they have this stance, we believe it only makes their practical benefits weaker because we believe that for side government to win, they have to tell us why they have to like emphasize these private education more than public education, right? That's the first problem of side government. Second response, how are they going to distinguish the vulnerable if they can't? And we believe when that's the case, homeschool is going to be normalized inside government's world. And that is why the practical harm our speakers told you is going to be real harms inside government's world, right? So yeah, and they talked about side government talked about like homeschooling is still in opposition side role. So the arguments we told you is still going to stand in our world. However, that we clearly say that that is not our stand. We don't want homeschooling that much happening inside side opposition, and we want public education. We want public education to improve more, right? So when that is our clear stance, let's move on to the classes. I have 3 classes, 2 major and 2 minor. First about like equal starting point, second about the most important one, socialization, third one, minor class about like dogmatic parents. So first class, equal starting point. So the side government characterized in the status quo as like current education is not equal. Like there's like private schools, there's a lot of wealth problem, and that is why they want homeschooling, right? So there is three responses. First, how is private schooling going to help this? Like parents are not teachers. They are different from teachers. There is college of education for a reason. People study 4 years to understand how children comprehends, right? When that is the case, we believe these homeschooling is much more worse. It cannot follow these public education, which are teachers teaching these students. So teachers are way better. Second response, when government clearly said that there is still going to be public education, we believe homeschooling is going to make social stigma. And they talked about like, so that's why we have to support them, right? I'm going to further move on. I'm going to further clarify this in my second clash, but I'm going to move on right now. So maybe like this social stigma and bullying is solved in the short term. Maybe I'm going to also prove you why this is not true, or maybe it's proved, maybe it's solved. However, when we come out to the real society, we believe these people are still going to get bullied because of the following reasons in the second class. So third response, private schools. So we believe these private homeschooling will have much more inequality. Why? Because it's a homeschool. Like your parents will decides your teacher. You can have a private teacher from Harvard or Yale. However, if your parents are unwealthy, you're not going to even have a private teacher, right? And that's the case. We believe equal starting point is not a clash that side government can win. So moving on to the second clash, which is about socialization, which is the most important clash in today's debate. So we believe side opposition demolished side government in this clash. Why? Our leader of opposition spent 6 minutes on talking about why antisocial kids have to come to school to socialize and learn. How it might be hard in the short-term effect. However, if you look at the long term, it is very necessary for these people. And we believe this is not exactly same. However, this can be appended to these minority students, right? So side government told us that homeschooling and they can help socialize these students by homeschooling. However, we don't understand how like making these students like away from school, away from other students can make, and then like helping them socialize is an like able thing to do. We believe that is quite preposterous in the first place to begin with. However, they said by the government stance of supporting these homeschooling, they're magically going to make society acknowledge these minorities and society acknowledge and understand the value of these minorities. However, Madam Speaker, we do not believe that is how society works. We believe there has to be interaction with people to understand minority. If I have never met a British guy like Oliver in my life, I would have never understood his like characteristics, right? However, the reason why I understand him right now because I interacted with him, right? We believe interaction, social discourse with others, other minorities is the key reason, key value for understanding. When that is not happening inside government's world, we believe the social recognition, social acknowledgement, nothing can happen inside government. Homeschooling, making these people go away from society. Wait, yes.
How can you guarantee that understanding of minorities naturally happens just because they start going to public school?
That is like hard thing in society right now. However, we're saying that we're giving you a substantive that by not like supporting homeschooling. However, we want like public education more better. However, we still have a chance, Madam Speaker. However, just separating these people from schools, we believe there is no chance of understanding, there is no chance of acknowledgement, right? So moving on to the third class, which is quite a funny class, like dogmatic parents, which is also a minor class. So, and we believe this is also like relevant to the education part. So we believe inside government's world where like parents have control of education, there's going to be more problem. There's going to be worse problems than echo chambers, right? Because when parents have the control of education, these parents stigma, these parents like racist ideas could be followed to the children's, right? However, inside opposition's world, where there is education in public, when there could be social discourse by students, and where teachers are educated in college not to do that, we believe this is a problem exclusive inside opposition, and that is why we believe side opposition takes today's debate home. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for a fine speech. Now to end the opposition's case, I'll reply here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Give me 1 second to sort my clock out. Okay, so sorry, 1 second. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so in this debate, one of the principal words that was mentioned in the notion was the notion of actively supports. The supposed role of the government was to actively support homeschooling. But unfortunately, because they didn't give any particular mechanisms, models, I know they don't have to give a model, so to speak, and they could do what they did, and we don't have no issue with it. But the way they chose to approach this basically meant that they were giving moral, theoretical, sort of like, you can do it kind of support. And, that's nice and all. And we believe that that's, a wonderful thing to maybe be doing. It's somewhat impotent and going to be very ineffective, but, it's good, I guess, in theory. But the main issue with this is that basically forced us into a debate that was about the virtues of home versus public schooling. We couldn't really deal with a particular model. We just had to deal with the values based upon doing one over the other. So we generally tried to craft an argument that was about the fact that there are no circumstances in which it's justifiable for a kid to be taken out of school for homeschooling. The reason for this is because it's so fundamentally important for every single child to gain the values of this education. As I mentioned in my first speech, the reason that society generally pushes people away from homeschooling is because they know that it's bad for them. They're worried about them being unsocialized. They're worried about them having weird beliefs. They know they're not going to understand things in the same way. And so the challenge is, this debate really needs to be about the values of homeschooling versus the values of public schooling, which is obviously what we spent most of our time doing. And I obviously understand that, one of the key stakeholders that were being used for analysis for this were minorities or whatever. But this wasn't really in the debate, and that wasn't really in your definition to begin with either. If you don't recall, your definition was just, you didn't really define it, but you just assumed that the majority of people were homeschoolers. I'm not even sure if you could even definitionally call homeschool children as being these particular kinds of people anyway. But regardless, we disagree with this particular characterization, firstly, because we think that, as we said, there are some people who are and some people who aren't. But then on the second half, you say maybe this debate should focus on these people because those are the stakeholders that are the most harmed by the active pushing away from kids going to homeschool. Fine, let's deal with you on that. No problem. Let's focus on this particular stakeholder and let's see how that runs out. So we talked about the lack of socialization, worse educational outcomes. Those are the two principal things. Now, a child who is in a minority group, who is, going to be anti-socialized compared to their colleagues and is going to be worse educated compared to their colleagues, is going to struggle for the rest of their life because of those two things in and of themselves. Now, their minority status and the bullying or whatever other reasons that were there for their bullying are still maybe going to affect them throughout their life. But you're not going to fix the problems by taking them out of school. You're going to add more problems. That was the point of our debate, is you're just piling problems onto these kids. We never tried to undermine bullying, as the DLO said. Like, we weren't just trying to mitigate the dangers of bullying. We understand that bullying is dangerous and we understand that it's harmful. But his whole speech and his whole rebuttal was predicated on the fact that this doesn't help them. And this was perfectly summarized by our whip speaker as well, because again, it doesn't allow them to socialize. It doesn't allow the other kids to socialize with them. It's going to push them on the outside. And as one of my POIs said, it's only going to other them more. And so the challenge is if the spirit of this debate is what's better for these children, which I don't believe it is, even if it was, I think we would still win on this case. But regardless of that, the active norm of increasing the value of increasing the theoretical sort of you can do it value of homeschooling, as I said in my first POI, is going to lead to more homeschooling. I don't think that's a particularly hard thing to have to justify. And so it's not just going to be minority kids. It's going to be a whole bunch of kids, and especially maybe even kids from bigoted parents who are going to choose that the school is a bit too woke for them. So they're going to teach their kids to be a little bit racist, a little bit more anti-Korean or whatever they want to be. But anyways, for these reasons that we've, proudly tried to oppose this debate to Ben. Hopefully the adjudicator agrees with us. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think the speaker for a fine speech. Now to end the government's case, gov reply here.
Right, gov reply. Give me a few seconds. All right.
Yep. Okay.
Oh, okay. Speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Judges, do not be fooled. This debate is not about traditional education versus homeschooling, right? It is not about the benefits or harms versus homeschooling versus public schools, right? Both systems exist in both what are we talking about today is the opposition needs to give us what harms does this government support do necessarily and prove why this intervention is not necessary, right? Which the government case is built upon in the first place. We tell you 3 points coming from opposition that we have all mitigated already. First, opposition reduces the stakeholders to all antisocial and all minorities only. First off, like they're assuming not only like all non-people of color are racist, all like non-trans people are hate trans people, right? But also, we're just trying to tell you that these people, these minorities, some of them are the most vulnerable, and we should be caring about them. And that is why we need the support in the first place, right? They assume really that these stakeholders simply don't want to attend school, right? We have already told you that these homeschool kids usually are the most vulnerable because they have a specific reason why they have no other option but homeschooling, right? Not just simple bullying, but rather systematic discrimination and risk that they are exposed to, such as hate crimes or gay kids killing themselves, right? This is even more relevant and urgent, and exactly why this support is necessary because these marginalized people exist, right? These people are already disadvantaged. Why should they have their education compromised on top of that, right? Another point that the opposition really tries to tell us is that, well, these bigoted parents will be encouraged with these homeschooling support, right? Bigots will stay bigots regardless in both worlds. It is not an exclusive harm. However, we tell you 2 points. First is that these bigots are not likely on their side of the house to not send them to public school anyway. But second point is that it is more likely for them to consider at least 1 to 2% chance of considering different perspectives if these resources and materials are provided to them, a better infrastructure is provided so that they know they have some kind of guidance. How should we be homeschooling their kids in the first place? Another thing that they give you is that, oh, public schools are so much better because they have an exclusive benefit of socialization. First off, public schooling still exists on our side, right? It's not like suddenly because the government actively supports homeschooling, just because the infrastructure is on par, it's on the same level as public schooling, suddenly everyone's gonna start homeschooling, right? That's not obviously going to happen. We're just trying to prove to you why this support is necessary because homeschooling is already disadvantaged in the status quo, and those people who are affected by it are the most vulnerable at most times. Also, they really assume that just people who are homeschooled just like do not socialize ever outside of being homeschooled, like they stay home forever, right? Yes, interacting with peers is much more easier if they do go to public schools, but again, this is just not necessary. Going to public school does not necessarily like guarantee that they will integrate perfectly and suddenly have like all friends and suddenly have all the social skills, right? They can still develop, like we can't just assume that like people who are homeschooled can still develop social skills within being homeschooled, right? They also tell you that it'll lead to more isolation, right? We tell you that homeschooling happens for various reasons, not just because they are minorities. And this, like, because they're isolated, this support becomes even more necessary, right? The opposition would rather just leave these people behind and or push them to public schools, ignoring all the reasons why, all the systematic racism, all the systematic oppression, discrimination that they face, when some of these people simply have no other option, right? This support is not necessarily harming anyone in the first place. If rich people, if bigoted parents, if these rich people, if these like religious people like want to homeschool their kids and they just have more resources, fine. They're not even likely to use it anyway. They're not even likely to care about the more support coming to them anyway, right? Also, so to wrap up, the opposition basically talks about like, oh, homeschooling is so bad and everyone should go to public school. The end goal for them seems to be sending everyone to public school, which is not even the crux of the debate, but also just extremely idealistic, right? And we also already told you, to some people, this is simply not an option, right? The debate is about how we can help these disenfranchised people receive quality education without like having their without it being compromised, right? We engage in all of this, yet opposition doesn't tell us why this government intervention or support is not necessary, or how this does not resolve the problem at the end of the day. Therefore, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
I think the speaker for a fine speech. Debaters will virtually cross the house. Once again,